We threw away those boxes in the garage. You never came for them anyway. My mother shrugged, holding my sister's housewarming gift while I stood in her kitchen last Tuesday. I asked which boxes exactly, and she laughed, saying, "The ones with your old junk from college. We needed space for your sister's wedding decorations." The champagne flute I'd been holding slipped from my fingers, shattering against the marble countertop. 23 boxes. My mother had just admitted to throwing away 23 boxes containing 8 years of research, 3 completed manuscripts, my entire photography portfolio from my graduate program, and irreplaceable letters from my late grandmother. My family had gathered for Natasha's housewarming party, celebrating her new 5-bedroom colonial that my parents had helped purchase. While everyone toasted her success, my mother casually mentioned destroying the only physical copies of work that represented my entire academic career. "Your old junk," I repeated, my voice eerily calm despite the blood roaring in my ears. The boxes clearly labeled Marin's research, do not discard, in permanent marker. My sister Natasha stopped mid-conversation with our aunt, finally noticing the broken glass and the way our mother's face had gone rigid. Dad emerged from the living room, sensing tension, his expression already defensive before understanding the situation. I watched them all freeze as I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone, scrolling through photos I'd taken 3 months ago during my last visit, showing those 23 boxes stacked neatly with visible warning labels, timestamps, and my contact information taped to each one. I am Marin, 32 years old, and until last Tuesday, I believed my family's neglect was just emotional distance. My parents had always favored Natasha, 5 years younger, prettier by conventional standards, and conveniently interested in the corporate career path they understood. When I chose anthropology and documentary photography, they called it your little hobby phase. When I won a prestigious research grant to study disappearing indigenous languages, they forgot to attend my celebration dinner. When my dissertation was published by a major university press, they asked when I'd get a real job. But I'd accepted this dynamic, carved out my own path, and maintained cordial distance while focusing on work that mattered to me. What they didn't know was that those boxes contained more than academic materials. Hidden among the research papers were 3 things that would soon become very relevant. Documentation of my great-grandmother's estate that my mother had handled after her death. Original deeds to property my parents claimed had been sold generations ago, and evidence of how they'd systematically redirected inheritance that should have been split between Natasha and me. My grandmother had warned me before her death, whispering during her final hospital stay about papers that prove what they did, urging me to keep everything she'd given me safe. I'd packed it all carefully, thinking I had time to sort through it properly. "They were just taking up space," my mother said defensively, her champagne glass trembling slightly. "You haven't lived here in 14 years, Marin. We assumed you'd taken anything important." Natasha shifted uncomfortably, her new engagement ring catching the light as she twisted her hands. "I needed room for my dress shopping bags and the wedding planning supplies," she added quietly, as if this justified destroying 8 years of irreplaceable work. My father stepped forward, using his authoritative professor voice. "Let's not make a scene at your sister's celebration. I'm sure we can discuss this rationally." But I wasn't interested in rational discussion. I was doing calculations, remembering every dismissive comment, every forgotten milestone, every time they'd prioritized Natasha's minor inconvenience over my major achievements. The room full of relatives watched as I carefully picked up the broken champagne glass, piece by piece, my movements deliberate and controlled. "Tell me," I said conversationally, "did you at least look through the boxes before throwing them out? Or did you just dump everything without checking what you were destroying?" The guilty silence told me everything. They hadn't even glanced inside. My mother set down her glass, that familiar defensive posture emerging. "Marin, you're overreacting. It was just old college papers. You're published now, aren't you? What do you need old drafts for?" The casual dismissal of years of work, The assumption that published work appeared fully formed without drafts and research notes, the complete lack of understanding about my field, it all crystallized into something cold and clear in my chest. "Just old college papers," I repeated slowly. Then I smiled, a real smile that made Natasha take a step backward. "You're right, Mom. Why would I need any of that?" I picked up my coat, slinging my purse over my shoulder. "Enjoy the party. The house looks beautiful, Natasha. I'm sure you'll be very happy here." My tone was pleasant, almost cheerful, which seemed to unnerve them more than anger would have. As I walked toward the door, my Aunt Megan followed, touching my arm gently. "Marin, honey, I'm sorry this happened. Your mother should have called you first." I patted her hand reassuringly. "It's fine, Aunt Megan. Really. Some mistakes can't be undone, but that doesn't mean they can't teach valuable lessons." My aunt frowned slightly, confused by my composure. "Will you be okay getting home? You seem calm." "I'm perfectly calm," I assured her. "In fact, I've never thought more clearly." I glanced back at my parents and sister, still frozen in the kitchen, probably expecting me to storm out or break down crying. Instead, I took out my phone and sent 3 quick texts, requests I'd been putting off because of family loyalty, but that loyalty had just been incinerated along with my life's work. My phone buzzed immediately with responses. The first was from my dissertation advisor, now a department chair at Columbia, confirming she'd contact her lawyer friend who specialized in estate law. The second was from a documentary filmmaker I'd collaborated with, saying he'd put me in touch with an investigative journalist he knew. The third was from my ex-boyfriend Elliot, a digital forensics specialist, saying he still had access to cloud recovery services that could restore documents even if physical copies were destroyed. Walking to my car, I noticed my parents' neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, tending her garden. She waved cheerfully, calling out congratulations on Natasha's new house. "Must be nice having such supportive parents," she said warmly. I paused, considering my response. "They've certainly made an impression," I replied carefully. "Mrs. Patterson, you wouldn't happen to remember when those boxes disappeared from my parents' garage, would you? I recall you mentioning you saw the waste management truck last month." Her face brightened. "Oh yes, it was 3 weeks ago, on a Thursday. Unusual for bulk pickup to come on a Thursday, but your mother had called special. I remember because I was surprised they were throwing out so many boxes without you being here. Seemed odd since they were all labeled with your name." She leaned closer conspiratorially. "Your mother told me you'd said to dispose of them, but I thought that strange since you'd been so careful labeling everything when you stored them." "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson," I said genuinely. "That's very helpful information." She didn't realize she'd just confirmed my parents had lied about thinking the boxes were unwanted. They'd known exactly what they were doing, made a deliberate decision to dispose of my belongings without permission, and then lied about it being an innocent mistake. Sitting in my car, I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I opened my laptop and began pulling up files I'd stored in various cloud accounts over the years. My grandmother's warnings echoed in my memory. She'd suspected my parents of financial manipulation regarding her estate, had told me to keep copies of everything, had made me promise to set things right when the time came. For 8 years, I'd avoided confronting my family about the inheritance discrepancies, telling myself maintaining peace was more important than money. But this wasn't about money anymore. This was about my mother casually erasing years of my work, my sister prioritizing her wedding decorations over my career, my father dismissing my pain as overreaction. This was about every time they'd chosen Natasha's comfort over my existence. My phone rang. "Natasha." I let it go to voicemail. It rang again. My mother. Voicemail. Then a text from my father. "You're being childish. Come back and apologize for ruining your sister's party." Apologize for being upset that they destroyed my life's work. The audacity was almost admirable. I texted back a single word. No. Then I blocked all 3 numbers, at least temporarily. They needed to understand that dismissing this as my overreaction wouldn't work this time. The investigation I was about to launch would be thorough and methodical. My grandmother's papers, the ones they'd thrown away, contained proof of financial misconduct. But what they didn't know was that I'd digitized everything 3 years ago during a visit, scanning documents late at night while they slept, saving them to encrypted cloud storage. I'd done it out of paranoia, worried something might happen to the physical copies. That paranoia had just saved me. The property deeds mentioned in my grandmother's papers showed land that supposedly sold in the 1970s still existed under different names, trusts my parents controlled. The estate documents revealed inheritance diverted through legal technicalities. The letters detailed systematic financial abuse of my grandmother during her final years, all of it digitally preserved despite my parents' attempt to destroy the evidence. Starting the car, I glanced back at the house where my sister's housewarming party continued, probably everyone inside discussing how dramatic I'd been over old papers. Let them think that. Let them believe I'd storm off, and eventually forgive them like I always had before. Let them feel secure in the knowledge that compliant Marin, who never made waves, would come around after cooling off. They had no idea that compliant Marin died the moment my mother shrugged about destroying 8 years of work. The woman driving away from that house was someone new, someone who understood that family loyalty worked both ways, someone who'd spent too many years accepting scraps while watching Natasha receive banquets. My first stop was a lawyer's office, not the family attorney my parents used, but someone Aunt Megan had recommended months ago when I'd casually asked about estate planning. Someone who specialized in elder abuse cases and estate disputes. Someone who'd be very interested in digitized documents showing financial manipulation of a deceased grandmother's assets. Tomorrow, I'd visit the county recorder's office, then the tax assessor. Then I'd start making calls to family members on my grandmother's side, people my parents had systematically distanced us from over the years, people who might have their own questions about how assets were divided after my grandmother's death. But tonight, I'd let my family celebrate Natasha's house, the one partially purchased with money that should have been mine. Let them toast to her success, built on the foundation of my grandmother's estate that my parents had fraudulently redirected. Let them believe they'd gotten away with it for 8 more years, because in exactly 72 hours, they'd be receiving certified letters from an attorney, and their perfect world would start cracking. And unlike those boxes they threw away so carelessly, what I was about to unleash couldn't be disposed of with a single phone call to waste management. The law office of Clara Webb occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated brownstone downtown, the kind of place that whispered competence rather than shouting it. I'd made the appointment during my drive from Natasha's party, and Clara had agreed to see me first thing Monday morning, despite her packed schedule. Aunt Megan's recommendation carried weight. Clara was in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and eyes that missed nothing. She listened without interrupting as I laid out the situation, starting with the thrown-away boxes and ending with my grandmother's warnings about financial manipulation. When I pulled up the digitized documents on my laptop, her expression shifted from professional interest to focused intensity. "Your grandmother documented everything," Clara said, scrolling through probate records. Property transfers, trust modifications, power of attorney abuses. This is elder financial exploitation, possibly criminal fraud. She glanced up. The statute of limitations depends on when you discovered the fraud, not when it occurred. You discovering this now starts the clock fresh. I'd expected legal jargon and complicated explanations. Instead, Clara spoke plainly. Your parents diverted approximately $3 million in property and assets that should have been split between you and your sister. The house Natasha just bought? 20% of that down payment came from the sale of property that was supposed to be yours. The number hit me physically. Over $2 million. Years of struggling through graduate school on ramen and third-shift coffee shop jobs, while my parents complained about supporting me with occasional grocery money. Meanwhile, Natasha's college was fully paid, her first apartment furnished by them, her car a graduation gift, and now her house, purchased partially with my stolen inheritance. "What are my options?" I asked. Clara's smile was sharp. "Multiple paths, civil suit to recover assets, criminal referral for elder abuse and fraud, petition to invalidate the trust modifications, and given that you've just discovered physical evidence was intentionally destroyed, we could argue obstruction." She tapped her pen against her notepad. "But litigation is slow and expensive. I'd recommend we start with a demand letter, lay out what we know, give them 72 hours to respond. Sometimes the threat of exposure is enough. And if they don't respond, then we file everything simultaneously. Civil court, criminal complaint. And I know an investigative journalist who specializes in family financial fraud. This type of story, wealthy parents stealing from their accomplished daughter to favor the golden child, it resonates." She paused. "But you need to be prepared. This will destroy your family relationships permanently." "They destroyed them when they threw away my life's work without a second thought," I said evenly. "I'm not looking for reconciliation. I'm looking for justice." Clara nodded slowly. "Then let's give them the chance to make this right quietly. If they refuse, we burn it all down." By Wednesday afternoon, my parents and Natasha had been served with certified letters outlining the evidence of fraud and demanding full accounting of my grandmother's estate. I'd also filed a police report about the destruction of my property, with Mrs. Patterson's statement confirming the timeline and my parents' deliberate disposal of clearly labeled boxes. Elliot had worked his digital forensics magic, recovering corrupted files from old hard drives I'd thought were dead. He sat in my apartment now, laptop surrounded by external drives, retrieving 8 years of research that my family assumed was gone forever. "Most of it's recoverable," he said, highlighting folders. "The manuscript drafts, your dissertation research, even some of your photography portfolio. Cloud backups from your old university email account saved more than you realized." Relief flooded through me. They didn't actually destroy everything. "They destroyed the originals," Elliot corrected. "That's still vandalism, destruction of property. The fact that you can recover digital copies doesn't negate their actions." He glanced at me, concerned. "Are you sure you want to go nuclear with this? Family lawsuits get ugly." "It was already ugly," I said. "I just didn't want to see it." My phone had been exploding with messages since the letters arrived. I'd unblocked my family's numbers temporarily, curious about their reaction. My mother's voicemail was predictably defensive. "I can't believe you're doing this over some old boxes. We're your family. You're being vindictive and cruel." My father's text was brief. "You're making a serious mistake. Call off your lawyer or face consequences." But Natasha's message was different. "Can we talk? Just us?" I agreed to meet her at a neutral location, a coffee shop equidistant from both our apartments. She arrived looking exhausted, her usually perfect appearance slightly disheveled. "Is this really about the boxes?" she asked immediately, sliding into the booth across from me. "Or is this about something else?" "It's about everything," I said. "The boxes were just the final straw. But since you asked, let's talk about the house you just bought. Did you know 20% of your down payment came from property that was supposed to be mine?" Her face went white. "What are you talking about?" I pulled out my tablet, showing her the property documents Clara had compiled. "Grandmother's land in Oregon that supposedly sold in 1978. It didn't. Mom and Dad transferred it to a trust, liquidated it 3 years ago, and put the money toward your house fund." I scrolled to another document. The stock portfolio that supposedly crashed in 2008. It didn't crash. They moved it to different accounts and used it for your college fund. Natasha stared at the documents, her hands trembling. "They told me grandmother left almost everything to charity because you two had a falling out." "I visited her every week until she died," I said flatly. She left detailed instructions for equal distribution. Mom and Dad manipulated the estate, probably had her sign documents while she was medicated and confused. I didn't know, Natasha whispered. Myron, I swear I didn't know. Maybe not the specifics, I acknowledged, but you knew something was off. You knew I struggled financially while you had everything handed to you. You knew I was storing important things at their house, and you asked them to throw it all out for your wedding decorations. My voice stayed calm, which seemed to frighten her more than yelling would have. You chose your convenience over my career, just like they've chosen you over me for 32 years. She was crying now, mascara running. What do you want? An apology? I'll apologize. I'll help pay for recovering your work. I don't want your apology, I said. And I'm already recovering my work. What I want is accountability. You benefited from stolen money. The ethical thing would be to return it. Return it? Marin, I just bought this house. I can't just give back the down payment. I'd lose everything. Yes, I agreed. You would. I stood, gathering my things. You have 3 days to decide if you want to negotiate a settlement with my attorney or fight this in court. If we go to court, everything becomes public record. Every detail of how Mom and Dad stole from their dying mother. How they used that money to buy your loyalty while I struggled. This will destroy our family, she said desperately. The family was destroyed the moment they valued your wedding decorations over my life's work, I replied. They just didn't realize it yet. Walking back to my car, I felt a strange lightness. For years, I'd carried guilt about not being the daughter my parents wanted, about not being as successful or pretty or easy as Natasha. I'd internalized their disappointment, assumed something was wrong with me. But seeing those documents, understanding the systematic theft that had funded my sister's perfect life while I barely survived, it reframed everything. They hadn't failed to love me. They'd actively chosen to rob me. My phone rang. Aunt Megan. I answered, expecting her to plead for family unity. Instead, she said, I saw the estate documents your lawyer sent. I always suspected something was wrong with how your grandmother's assets were divided. Count me as a witness if you need one. Aunt Megan. Your grandmother was my sister, she interrupted. I watched your parents manipulate her in her final years. I should have fought harder then. I'm fighting now. She paused. Also, I've contacted your cousins on your grandmother's side. They have questions about their inheritance too. Turns out your parents aren't the only ones who think they're entitled to other people's money. After we hung up, I sat in my car, processing this development. What started as recovering my stolen inheritance was expanding. Other family members had been cheated. My parents' fraud went deeper than I'd realized. Clara called an hour later. Your parents' attorney just contacted me. They want to negotiate. They're offering $50, $0 to settle and make this go away quietly. $50 US out of $2, $3 million they stole, I said. That's insulting. Agreed. I told them we'd see them in court. But Marin, there's something else. I filed a forensic accounting request. Your parents have been living beyond their means for years. They're heavily mortgaged, multiple credit cards maxed out. If we push this to trial and win, they won't be able to pay. So they'll lose their house, I said. Everything they've built on stolen money. Potentially, yes. And your sister's house purchase could be voided if we prove the down payment came from fraudulent assets. Clara's voice held a question. Are you prepared for that outcome? I thought about my mother's shrug, my father's dismissive text, Natasha's tears that came only when she faced consequences. I thought about 8 years of research thrown away like garbage, about my grandmother's warnings I'd ignored too long. I'm prepared, I said. File everything. The forensic accountant Clara hired was a methodical woman named Ruth, who approached financial records like an archaeologist excavating lies. Within 2 weeks, she'd constructed a timeline of my parents' fraud that was almost artistic in its comprehensiveness. Every diverted dollar, every falsified document, every transfer from my grandmother's accounts to theirs, mapped out in spreadsheets and annotated charts. They were sophisticated about it, Ruth explained during our meeting in Clara's conference room. Small transfers that wouldn't trigger automatic reviews, property sales processed through shell LLCs, trust modifications filed in different counties to avoid pattern recognition. She slid a document across the table. But they got greedy toward the end. Large transfers right after your grandmother's death, probably thinking no one would audit carefully during the grief period. I studied the numbers, seeing my parents' financial decline coincide with their theft acceleration. They'd maintained appearances by stealing from my grandmother, then from me. How much total? $2, $7 million over 12 years, Ruth said. Starting when your grandmother first showed signs of dementia. They had her sign power of attorney documents, trust modifications, property transfers, all technically legal if she had capacity to consent. But your grandmother's medical records tell a different story. Clara pulled up medical files on her laptop. I subpoenaed your grandmother's healthcare records. She was diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's 8 months before the first major trust modification. Her doctor noted concerns about her ability to manage complex financial decisions. Yet somehow she signed documents transferring primary beneficiary status from you and Natasha equally to a trust your parents controlled. The pieces assembled into a picture of calculated exploitation. My parents had seen my grandmother's vulnerability as opportunity, had used her declining mental capacity to redirect her estate. They'd literally stolen from a confused, dying woman. And they'd done it while I visited her weekly, holding her hand, listening to her increasingly fragmented memories, never suspecting the systematic theft happening around me. What's our strongest legal angle? I asked. Criminal elder abuse, Clara said immediately. Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. The medical records prove she lacked capacity when she signed those documents. That makes the transfers voidable and potentially criminal. She pulled up another file. But there's more. Your father was your grandmother's financial power of attorney. He had a fiduciary duty to act in her best interest. Instead, he transferred her assets to himself and his wife. That's not just theft, it's a betrayal of legal duty. How long could he face in prison? The question surprised me with its coldness. 5 to 10 years if convicted on all counts, Clara said. Your mother too, as a co-conspirator. And they'd be ordered to pay restitution, which they can't afford. So yes, they'd lose their house, their retirement accounts, everything. I sat back, letting this settle. My parents in prison. My childhood home sold to pay restitution. Natasha losing her house because the down payment was fraudulent. Total destruction of everything they'd built on my grandmother's stolen money. Do it, I said. The criminal complaint was filed on a Friday. By Monday, my parents' faces were in the local newspaper under the headline, Local Couple Charged with Elder Financial Abuse. The article detailed the charges, the amount stolen, the victim being the husband's own mother. Comments online were vicious, people expressing disgust at children who'd steal from their dying parent. My phone became a weapon of psychological warfare. My mother called 14 times in 2 hours, leaving increasingly hysterical voicemails. How could you do this to us? We're your parents. You're destroying our lives over money. My father's messages were angrier, threatening to countersue for defamation, claiming I'd fabricated evidence, insisting they'd done nothing wrong. Natasha's calls were different, desperate. Please, Marin, pull back the criminal charges. Mom's having panic attacks. Dad's blood pressure is dangerous. This is killing them. Her voice cracked. I know they made mistakes, but prison? Really? Mistakes? I repeated carefully. They systematically stole from grandmother for 12 years while she lost her mind. They threw away 8 years of my work because they needed space for your wedding decorations. These aren't mistakes, Natasha. These are choices. But prison, she whispered. They're not criminals. Elder financial abuse is a crime, I said. They're literally criminals by definition. And you're benefiting from stolen money. That makes you complicit unless you're willing to return what was taken. Silence. Then, I can't afford to return $200, zeros or dollars. I'd lose my house, ruin my credit. It would destroy my life. It would inconvenience your life, I corrected. You'd have to sell the house, move somewhere smaller, rebuild. Uncomfortable but survivable. Unlike what they did to grandmother, stealing from her while she was helpless. Unlike what they did to me, erasing my career without a second thought. You've become cruel, Natasha said, her voice hollow. I've become fair, I replied. There's a difference. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. In the meantime, Clara filed the civil suit to recover assets, naming my parents and, after careful consideration, Natasha as defendants. She received stolen property, Clara explained. Even if she didn't know its origin, she's legally liable to return it once informed. This pushed Natasha over some edge. She showed up at my apartment at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday, bypassing the security door by following another resident. She pounded on my door, shouting loud enough that neighbors peered out into the hallway. I opened the door to find her disheveled, eyes red and wild. You added me to the lawsuit, she said, her voice shaking. Your own sister. You're actually going to sue me. You received $200,000 in stolen money, I said calmly. The law requires you to return it. I didn't know it was stolen. You do now. I stepped aside. Come in before you wake the whole building. She stumbled inside, collapsing onto my couch. Do you hate me that much? Hate us? Is this really about money, or is it revenge for every time Mom praised me instead of you? Every time Dad remembered my achievements but forgot yours? She looked up, genuine anguish on her face. Because if that's what this is, just tell me. Tell me you're punishing us for not loving you enough. The accusation should have angered me. Instead, I felt nothing. This isn't about love, Natasha. It's about theft. If you'd stolen my laptop, I'd call the police. They stole $7 million. The principle doesn't change just because they're family. Everything isn't black and white, she insisted. There's nuance, context, family loyalty. Family loyalty is reciprocal, I interrupted. Where was their loyalty when grandmother needed protection from financial predators? Where was their loyalty when they threw away my research? Where's your loyalty in refusing to return money you now know is stolen? I sat across from her. You want nuance? Here's nuance. I'm giving you an option they didn't give me. Negotiate a payment plan with my attorney. Return the money over time. Keep your house while making restitution. That's more mercy than they showed grandmother. I can't afford any payment plan, she said miserably. I'm barely making my mortgage now. Then you bought a house you couldn't afford with stolen money, I said. That's not my problem. That's yours. She left eventually, after trying several more emotional appeals that bounced off me like rain off glass. I'd discovered something interesting during my weeks of legal preparation. I'd been trained my entire life to absorb their emotions, manage their comfort, sacrifice my needs for their peace. But that training had an off switch. Once I found it, their tears and rage and desperation just became noise. Elliot had finished recovering my research files and helped me set up new cloud backup systems with encryption that would prevent anyone from accessing my work without authorization. You've changed, he observed one evening, watching me organize recovered documents with clinical efficiency. Not bad different, just harder. I had to be soft for 32 years, I said. I'm done. The investigation expanded in unexpected directions. Ruth discovered my parents had taken out a second mortgage on their house, using forged documents claiming my grandmother's property as collateral. They'd borrowed against assets they didn't legally own. This added bank fraud to their growing list of charges. Other relatives came forward with their own stories. My cousin Harper had loaned my parents $50, 3 years ago for emergency medical expenses. The money was never repaid. My Uncle Miles had invested in a business venture my father pitched, losing $75 when the business mysteriously dissolved. Patterns emerged of my parents treating family like an ATM, always with elaborate stories, always promising repayment that never came. Clara filed an amended complaint, including these additional victims. "This isn't about one daughter recovering her inheritance anymore," she said. "This is about serial financial fraud. The prosecutor is taking this very seriously." 6 weeks after the criminal charges were filed, my parents attempted one final negotiation. They offered to return $500 immediately if I dropped all charges, civil and criminal. Clara brought me the offer with a neutral expression, letting me decide without pressure. "Where would they get $500, $0? I asked. "They'd sell their house, liquidate retirement accounts, probably take loans. It would essentially bankrupt them, but they'd avoid prison." I thought about this. $500,000, immediate payment. My grandmother's stolen money partially recovered. My parents financially ruined but free. Natasha keeping her house. Family relationships damaged but not destroyed beyond all possibility of distant future contact. "Tell them no," I said. "We're going to trial. All of it. Criminal and civil." Clara nodded slowly. "Can I ask why?" $500? $0 is significant. It's more than many victims recover in these cases. "Because they still don't think they did anything wrong," I said. "The offer isn't remorseful restitution. It's buying their way out of consequences. If I accept, they'll tell everyone I was vindictive and greedy, that I forced them into bankruptcy over a family misunderstanding." I met Clara's eyes. "I want a verdict. I want official recognition that what they did was criminal. I want permanent record that my grandmother was abused and they were convicted for it." "Even if it means you might recover less money overall?" This stopped being about money the moment I saw my grandmother's medical records showing they stole from her while she had dementia, I said. "This is about justice now." The trial began on a surprisingly beautiful Tuesday in October, the kind of autumn day that made the courthouse steps look almost cinematic. News crews had set up cameras, drawn by the story's tabloid elements. Wealthy family, stolen inheritance, aging grandmother exploited. My parents arrived through a side entrance, avoiding the press, their expensive lawyer shepherding them past reporters shouting questions. I walked up the front steps with Clara, making no effort to hide. A reporter called out, "Marin, do you have any regrets about prosecuting your own parents?" I paused, considering the question seriously. "My only regret," I said clearly, "is not discovering their theft while my grandmother was alive to see justice." Then I continued inside, leaving them with that soundbite. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. Ruth testified for 3 hours, walking the jury through spreadsheets showing systematic theft. My grandmother's neurologist testified about her Alzheimer's diagnosis and declining capacity. Clara presented the medical records alongside the financial documents, creating an irrefutable timeline. Cognitive decline coinciding with massive asset transfers. The defense attorney, a silver-haired man named Marcus Wellington, attempted to portray everything as a misunderstanding, claiming my grandmother had willingly restructured her estate. "Families make financial decisions together," he argued. "Complex estate planning that appears suspicious to outsiders is often simply prudent management by trusted family members." Then Clara called me to testify. I'd prepared for this, rehearsed with Clara, knew exactly what questions were coming. But sitting in the witness box, raising my right hand to swear truth, looking at my parents at the defense table, it hit differently than preparation had suggested. My mother was crying silently, dabbing at her eyes with tissue. My father stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Clara walked me through my relationship with my grandmother, the weekly visits, her warnings about papers that prove what they did. She had me describe finding the documents, discovering the scope of the theft, my parents' reaction when confronted. "What happened when you tried to discuss this with your family before filing charges?" Clara asked. My mother shrugged and said the boxes containing evidence were just taking up space. I testified. "My father told me I was overreacting. My sister said she needed room for wedding decorations." I kept my voice steady, factual. "They showed no remorse for destroying 8 years of my work, no concern for my grandmother's exploitation, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing." Wellington's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to paint me as a vindictive daughter jealous of my sister, someone who'd fabricated claims to get revenge for perceived childhood slights. "Isn't it true you've always resented your sister's success?" he asked, his tone implying this explained everything. "I resent that her success was funded by money stolen from our dying grandmother," I replied evenly. "If she'd succeeded on her own merit, I'd celebrate it." "You've never gotten along with your parents, have you?" "I got along fine with them until I discovered they'd committed elder abuse and fraud." Wellington tried several more angles, suggesting I'd manipulated evidence, misinterpreted estate planning, exaggerated my grandmother's cognitive decline. Clara objected repeatedly, and the judge sustained most objections, growing visibly annoyed with Wellington's tactics. The turning point came when Clara played a recording I'd found among my grandmother's belongings. On her 80th birthday, 3 years before her death and 1 year into her Alzheimer's diagnosis, someone had given her a digital voice recorder to preserve memories. She'd recorded dozens of short audio journals, most confused and rambling. But one entry, dated 6 months before the first major trust modification, was crystal clear. My grandmother's voice filled the courtroom. "I worry about what happens to my money when I'm gone. I made clear instructions, equal for Marin and Natasha, my 2 granddaughters. But my son keeps bringing papers for me to sign. He says it's better this way, more efficient. But I don't understand the papers anymore. Everything confuses me now. I hope Marin reads this someday if something goes wrong. She's smart. She'll know what to do." The jury's reaction was visceral. 2 jurors wiped at their eyes. Another shook his head in disgust. My mother's sobbing became audible. My father remained rigid, but his face had gone gray. Wellington tried to recover, suggesting the recording was taken out of context, that my grandmother was simply expressing normal elderly anxiety. But the damage was done. The jury had heard a woman begging her granddaughter for help, documenting her own exploitation in real time, knowing something was wrong but too confused to stop it. My parents didn't testify, taking the Fifth Amendment on advice of counsel. This meant the jury only heard the evidence against them, never their side of the story. Legally protective, but psychologically damaging, Natasha attended every day of the trial, sitting in the back row, watching our family disintegrate in legal proceedings. She tried to speak to me during one recess, cornering me in the hallway. "Please," she whispered. "Even now you could stop this. Tell them you forgive them, that it was all a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding," I repeated quietly. "They stole from a woman with dementia. That's not a misunderstanding. That's elder abuse. They're our parents," she said desperately. "Don't you care what happens to them?" "I care that they face consequences for their actions," I said, "just like anyone else who commits crimes." The closing arguments were theatrical. Wellington painted my parents as devoted children who'd managed their mother's complex estate during difficult times, victimized by a vengeful daughter seeking attention. "Families disagree about estate planning," he told the jury. "That doesn't make it criminal." But Clara's closing was surgically precise. "The defense wants you to believe this is about complicated family dynamics. It's not. It's about an elderly woman with Alzheimer's who begged her granddaughter for help, about financial documents signed when she couldn't understand them, about $2, $7 million stolen from a vulnerable adult." She paused, letting it sink in. The defendant exploited his own mother's confusion to steal her assets. There's no complicated family dynamic that justifies that. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. When they filed back in, I studied their faces, looking for tells. The forewoman, a woman in her 60s who'd been a nurse, looked at my parents with something like contempt. That told me everything. On count 1, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. How do you find? Guilty. On count 2, fraud in estate administration. How do you find? Guilty. 5 counts total. Guilty on all 5. My mother collapsed, held upright by Wellington. My father's face crumpled, decades of arrogant confidence evaporating. Natasha's gasp was audible from the back row. The judge scheduled sentencing for 3 weeks later, denying bail. The defendants have significant financial resources that could be hidden, she explained. They'll remain in custody pending sentencing. Watching my parents being led away in handcuffs felt surreal, like witnessing a movie rather than my life. Natasha pushed through the crowd, confronting me in the courthouse hallway. "Are you happy now?" she demanded, tears streaming. "You've destroyed them, destroyed all of us." "They destroyed themselves," I said, "and they tried to destroy me in the process. I just documented it. I'll never forgive you for this," she spat. "Never." "I don't need your forgiveness," I replied. "I need you to return the stolen money," which brings us to the civil trial. That starts in 2 months. Her face went white. In the trauma of the criminal conviction, she'd apparently forgotten about the civil suit still pending. "You're still going through with that? Even after this?" "Especially after this," I said. "The criminal conviction proves the money was stolen. Now you have to return it." Outside, reporters swarmed. I gave a brief statement. "Justice was served today for my grandmother, who couldn't defend herself against the people who should have protected her. This verdict sends a message that elder abuse has consequences, even when committed by family." Clara fielded technical questions while I walked to my car, processing the finality of what had just happened. My parents were convicted felons now, facing years in prison. Our family was irrevocably shattered. And I felt nothing. No triumph. No regret. Just a strange emptiness where familial obligation used to live. Elliot called as I drove home. "I saw the verdict online. How are you holding up?" "I'm fine," I said, and realized it was true. "They're convicted. Now comes sentencing and the civil trial. Then it's over." "And then what?" he asked gently. "After all this is done, after you've recovered your inheritance, after they're in prison, what comes next for you?" It was a good question. I'd spent so much time focused on justice, on holding them accountable, that I hadn't thought about what life looked like on the other side. "I continue my work," I said finally. "The research they tried to destroy. I publish it, present it, make something meaningful from what they attempted to erase." "That sounds like a good plan," Elliot said. "And maybe, eventually, you find a way to be more than just the woman who convicted her parents." "Maybe," I agreed. But privately, I thought being the woman who convicted her parents was a pretty good starting point for rebuilding a life. The sentencing hearing arrived 3 weeks later, with none of the media circus that had surrounded the trial. The verdict was old news now, replaced in public attention by fresher scandals. But the courtroom was still full, primarily with family members and people I'd never met. Victims of my parents' other financial schemes coming to witness justice. My mother had aged visibly during her weeks in custody, her carefully maintained appearance dissolving into gray roots and unmanicured nails. My father looked smaller somehow, the commanding presence that had intimidated me. My entire childhood reduced to a man in an orange jumpsuit who avoided eye contact. The judge reviewed the pre-sentencing reports, victim impact statements, and character references submitted by both sides. Wellington had produced letters from my parents' friends and colleagues attesting to their good character, their community involvement, their decades of marriage. Clara had produced medical records documenting my grandmother's final years, financial records showing the systematic theft, and statements from multiple victims describing other frauds. "The court has reviewed all submitted materials," Judge Richardson began, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned over decades on the bench. "This case represents a profound breach of trust. The defendants exploited a vulnerable elderly woman during her cognitive decline, violating both legal duty and basic human decency." She addressed my father directly. "You held power of attorney for your mother. The law entrusted you to act in her best interest. Instead, you systematically stole from her, redirecting assets meant for your daughters to yourself. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated, sustained betrayal, spanning 12 years. My father's lawyer tried to interject, requesting leniency based on my father's age and health conditions. Judge Richardson held up a hand. "Your client is 64 years old, in reasonably good health, and fully understood the consequences of his actions. His mother was elderly, cognitively impaired, and helpless to stop him. The court finds no compelling reason for leniency." The sentence came down hard: 8 years for my father, 6 for my mother, with mandatory restitution of the full $7 million plus interest and legal fees. Additionally, Judge Richardson continued, "The defendants are ordered to surrender all assets for liquidation to satisfy restitution. This includes their primary residence, vehicles, retirement accounts, and any other holdings." My mother sobbed audibly. My father simply closed his eyes, the reality of losing everything finally penetrating his defenses. Wellington immediately announced plans to appeal, but Judge Richardson was unmoved. "Appeal is your right. The sentences stand pending any appellate review." As they were led away, my father finally looked at me. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Not of prison, but of the daughter he'd underestimated his entire life. The daughter who'd systematically dismantled his entire existence because he'd thrown away her research papers. Natasha didn't attend the sentencing, sending instead a letter to the judge, begging for mercy that went unread. She was focused on her own legal problems now. The civil trial had been expedited given the criminal conviction. With guilt established, the only question was damages and recovery. The civil trial was mercifully brief. Clara presented the criminal verdict, the documented theft, and the traced funds that had gone into Natasha's house purchase. Natasha's attorney, a tired-looking man clearly working on a tight budget, tried arguing she was an innocent beneficiary unaware of the fund's origin. Clara destroyed this argument by presenting text messages. In one exchange from 2 years ago, Natasha had texted my mother, "Are you sure it's okay to use grandmother's money for my house? What if Marin finds out?" My mother's response, "Your grandmother wanted you to have a nice house. Marin has her career. This is fair." The jury deliberated for 90 minutes before returning a verdict requiring Natasha to return the full $200, $0 plus interest. Since she couldn't pay immediately, the judge ordered the house sold to satisfy the judgment. I sat in the courtroom and watched my sister learn she'd lose her home because she'd knowingly accepted stolen money. Her face crumpled. Her lawyer put a hand on her shoulder, and I felt nothing. No satisfaction, no guilt. Just the clinical observation that actions had consequences. After the verdict, Natasha found me in the parking lot. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice hollow. "You've destroyed everything. Mom and Dad are in prison. I'm losing my house. Our family is gone." "The family was gone when they chose to steal from grandmother," I replied. "I just made it official. What are you going to do with all that money?" she asked bitterly. "Buy yourself a mansion? Take a world tour? Celebrate destroying us? I'm going to establish a foundation in grandmother's name, I said. Funding research on protecting elderly people from financial abuse, making sure other families' predators face consequences. I paused. And I'm publishing my research, the work you helped destroy. Turns out the digitized backups were actually cleaner than the original files. So thank you for that. She stared at me, searching for some crack in my composure, some sign of regret or pain. Finding nothing, she walked away without another word. The asset liquidation happened quickly. My parents' house sold within 3 weeks, purchased by a young family unaware of its history. Their furniture, cars, personal belongings, everything auctioned off. The retirement accounts they'd been building for decades, emptied to pay restitution. Between the house sale and liquidated assets, nearly $1. $9 million was recovered immediately. The remaining $800,000 would come from Natasha's house sale and garnished prison wages over the next decade. Clara set up a structured payment plan ensuring I'd eventually recover the full amount plus legal fees. What about the recovered research funds? Clara asked during our final meeting. Your parents destroyed property valued at approximately $50 based on replacement costs, emotional distress, and professional impact. That's separate from the inheritance theft. Add it to the foundation, I said. I don't need compensation for that. I need the work to continue. Within 6 months, I'd re-established my research program with funding from the foundation and a prestigious university position. My dissertation research, the 8 years of work my parents had tried to erase, was published by a major academic press. Reviews praised its groundbreaking approach to indigenous language preservation and meticulous documentation of disappearing cultural knowledge. I dedicated the book to my grandmother. For Lillian, who warned me to protect what matters and to seek justice when protection fails. The photography portfolio I'd thought destroyed forever became the centerpiece of an exhibition at a respected gallery. The artist's statement read, "These images were briefly destroyed by people who couldn't see their value. They were recovered through determination and the principle that meaningful work survives attempted erasure." My parents' appeal was denied. The convictions stood. They'd serve their full sentences with possibility of parole after serving 80%. That meant 6.5 years for my father, 5 for my mother, assuming good behavior. Natasha's house sold 3 months after the verdict. She moved into a small apartment across town, took a full-time position at a retail company, and blocked me on all social media. Mutual acquaintances reported she told everyone I'd stolen her house over a family disagreement, and refused to acknowledge the criminal convictions or her knowing acceptance of stolen funds. I didn't correct the narrative. Let her believe what she needed to believe. Reality was already documented in court records, permanently searchable, impossible to revise. Aunt Megan became my closest family connection, the only relative who'd supported my pursuit of justice without reservation. She helped me sort through my grandmother's remaining possessions, items my parents hadn't managed to liquidate or sell. We found photographs, letters, recipes handwritten on index cards, the small, intimate things that comprise a life. Your grandmother would be proud, Megan said one afternoon as we organized boxes in her living room. Not just that you held them accountable, but that you turned it into something meaningful. The foundation, the research, using your inheritance to prevent other families from experiencing what you did. I don't know if she'd be proud, I admitted. I sent her son to prison. She'd be proud you protected her memory, Megan corrected. She spent her final years confused and afraid, knowing something was wrong but unable to articulate it. You gave her justice when she couldn't fight for herself. That's love, Maureen. The real kind. 2 years after the trial, I stood in my new office at the university, unpacking the last boxes of books and research materials. The space was bright, overlooking the campus quad, with enough room for meetings and the grad students I'd begun mentoring. On the wall hung my grandmother's portrait, painted when she was 40, vibrant and clear-eyed. The woman she'd been before Alzheimer's stole her memories, and my parents stole her money. Elliot appeared in the doorway carrying coffee. We'd reconnected after the trial, rebuilding our relationship slowly, carefully. Two people who'd learned the importance of trust and honesty. "Your 11 o'clock is here," he said. "The documentary people." The filmmakers wanted to create a piece about elder financial abuse, using my family's case as the centerpiece. I'd initially declined, wanting to move forward rather than continually revisit the past. But they'd proposed including information about warning signs, legal protections, resources for victims. It would serve the Foundation's mission while documenting what happened. "Tell them I'll be right there," I said, adjusting the photograph one final time. My parents were 3 years into their sentences now. I'd received no communication from either of them, no apology, no acknowledgement of harm caused. Prison administrators informed me they could request mediation if desired, but I'd declined. I had nothing to say to them that wasn't already said in court testimony. Natasha had attempted contact once, a long email sent from a new address, explaining she understood now how she'd benefited from their theft, expressing regret for her role, hoping someday we might reconnect. I'd read it carefully, considered her words, then replied with a single sentence. "I wish you well in rebuilding your life, as I have rebuilt mine." She didn't respond. I didn't expect her to. The Foundation had grown beyond my initial vision, establishing partnerships with law schools, elder care advocacy groups, and state protection agencies. We'd funded research, created educational materials, and lobbied for stronger elder abuse laws. My grandmother's name appeared on buildings, scholarships, programs that would outlive us all, transforming her victimization into protection for others. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if I'd gone too far, if destroying my family's lives, sending my parents to prison, forcing my sister into bankruptcy, was proportional to boxes thrown away and money stolen. But then I'd remember my grandmother's voice on that recording, confused and afraid, begging me to know what to do if something went wrong. I'd known what to do. I'd done it. And I'd sleep fine. Walking into the conference room to meet the documentarians, I carried the folder of materials I'd prepared. Court documents, photographs, my grandmother's audio recordings, the evidence that told the story completely. They'd want to frame this as a cautionary tale, a warning about family dynamics and financial exploitation. But it was more than that. It was proof that even people who seem powerless, dismissed and underestimated their entire lives, can dismantle everything built on their exploitation. It was evidence that justice, while slow, could be absolute. It was demonstration that you don't need to forgive people who harm you, that choosing accountability over peace is sometimes the most loving thing you can do. The filmmakers were young, earnest, treating the material with appropriate gravity. They asked about the trial, the investigation, the emotional impact. "Do you have any regrets?" the director asked, a standard question they probably asked everyone. I considered this seriously, not giving the expected answer. "I regret not investigating sooner," I said finally. "I regret every year they stole from my grandmother while I visited her weekly, never suspecting. I regret the 8 years I spent building a career while they undermined me financially." I paused. "But I don't regret holding them accountable. That's not something that requires forgiveness from me or understanding from anyone else." They included this quote in the final documentary, which premiered at a film festival 18 months later. The response was overwhelming. Victim advocacy groups hosting screenings, law schools using it as teaching material, families reaching out to share their own stories of elder abuse and financial manipulation. On the evening of the premiere, I sat in the theater watching my family's destruction play out on screen, narrated by actors reading our words, animated with court documents and photographs. When my grandmother's voice played during the climax, explaining her confusion and fear, the audience sat in absolute silence. Afterward, during the Q&A, someone asked the question that always came. Do you think your parents have learned anything from this experience? I don't know, I answered honestly, but that's not why I did it. I didn't prosecute them to teach them a lesson. I did it to get justice for my grandmother and to recover what they stole. Whether they've learned anything is irrelevant to me. Do you ever think about reconciliation? Another person asked. No, I said simply. Reconciliation requires remorse from the people who caused harm. I've received no indication of remorse, just anger that I held them accountable. So no, I don't think about reconciliation. I think about moving forward. 5 years after the trial, I received notification that my mother had applied for early parole. The parole board requested my input as the primary victim. I submitted a written statement objecting to early release, detailing the calculated nature of the crimes, the lack of remorse, the continued denial of wrongdoing. The parole board denied her application. She'd serve her full sentence. My father didn't apply for parole, apparently understanding it would be futile. According to the limited information I received, he spent his time in the prison library, reading about estate law, perhaps finally educating himself on the statutes he'd violated. Natasha rebuilt her life slowly, publicly maintaining her narrative that I'd been vindictive over a misunderstanding. But privately, through mutual acquaintances, I heard she'd become an advocate for financial literacy, teaching workshops on understanding estate planning and recognizing financial manipulation. She never acknowledged the irony. I never corrected her public narrative. The court records existed for anyone interested in truth. Those who believed her revised version weren't people I needed in my life anyway. 10 years after the trial, I stood at my grandmother's grave with Aunt Megan, placing fresh flowers on the headstone we'd replaced. The new one included dates, her name, and a simple epitaph. Lillian Mitchell, beloved mother, grandmother, victim of elder abuse, catalyst for justice. She'd love knowing that her story saved other people, Megan said softly, that her suffering had meaning. Her suffering shouldn't have had to have meaning, I replied. She shouldn't have suffered at all. But yes, I think she'd approve of what came from it. We stood in silence for a moment, two women who'd refused to let an old woman's victimization be forgotten or forgiven. Then we walked back to the car, back to our lives, carrying forward the lesson my grandmother had taught me in her final confused years. Trust actions over words, document everything, and never assume family loyalty protects you from family greed. My parents would be released eventually, elderly and broken, their reputation destroyed, their finances in ruins, facing a world that knew exactly what they'd done. Natasha would continue her life, permanently marked by the stolen house and the sister who'd held her accountable. And I would continue my work, building on the foundation of justice I'd constructed from the wreckage of a family that valued money over integrity. Sometimes people asked if I'd do anything differently. The answer was always no. Given the same circumstances, the same betrayals, the same casual dismissal of my life's work and my grandmother's suffering, I'd make the same choices. Justice doesn't require kindness. Accountability doesn't require forgiveness. And family doesn't grant immunity from consequences. These weren't lessons I'd wanted to learn, but they were lessons I'd mastered completely, carved into my identity as permanently as the scars my family had tried to inflict. And unlike the boxes they'd thrown away, unlike the money they'd stolen, unlike the grandmother they'd exploited, these lessons were mine forever, unbreakable and undeniable. The woman who'd stood in her sister's kitchen 5 years ago, hearing that her life's work had been thrown away, had been destroyed just as thoroughly as those boxes. But from her ashes had emerged someone stronger, someone who understood that mercy given to people who show no remorse isn't compassion. It's just enabling their next betrayal. I'd chosen justice instead, and I'd never looked back.